the condemned brides who rebuilt a broken ranch, and a broken man. The well rope had frayed down to maybe 4 good strands, and I was standing there in the dark holding it, feeling where it was going to go, when the wagon came over the ridge. I heard it before I saw it, axle grinding, 2 horses pulling harder than they should have had to. The moon was a quarter thing, not much help, but I could see the shape of it, a freight wagon with a canvas cover, and a man up on the bench who wasn't driving so much as surviving the road. Behind it, another wagon, 2 riders alongside who I didn't recognize. I dropped the rope back down the well shaft and went to get my rifle from inside the barn, not because I was afraid, more habit than anything. 3 years alone on a spread that was going to pieces around me. You got to where you answered the door with a gun the way other men answered it with a lantern. I came back out. The lead wagon had pulled up by the gate and the driver was hollering my name. Caleb Hearn. He said it like a question and a statement both. I walked out to him with the rifle at my side, not raised but present. He was a freighter out of Dalhart named Gus Prewitt, a man I'd done business with twice before, and he looked relieved to see me in the way. A man looks relieved when he's been carrying something that wasn't rightly his to carry, and he's finally found who it belongs to. He said, "I got a situation, Caleb." I said, "I see that." He said, "I was contracted to deliver these women to a man named Aldous Wreck over at the Wreck Spread, the one on the South Fork of the Cimarron, and I got out there 2 days ago and the place was abandoned. Burned out. Nothing left but the chimney stack and a dead dog. Nobody in a 2-hour ride in any direction could tell me where Wreck went or if he was even alive. And I've got 7 women in these wagons who were supposed to be wives, and now they got nowhere to go." I stood there. The canvas on the lead wagon shifted and I saw a face looking out at me. A woman, maybe 40, with dark eyes that didn't look frightened so much as exhausted and measuring. She was taking the measure of the place. The barn with the door that didn't hang right. The house with the dark windows. The yard that had been something once and was working its way back toward nothing. I said, "Gus, I'm not exactly in a position to take on guests." He said, "I know it." I said, "The house leaks in 2 places, and I've been living on beans and dried beef for going on 6 weeks, and I got a well rope about to go and a south fence down in 3 spots that I haven't had the heart to fix." He said, "I know all that too, Caleb." There was a long quiet. He said, "I'll stay 2 nights, help you settle them in, give you what supplies I can spare off the freight, and then I got to get back to Dalhart. But I can't drive these women back across that country with winter coming on. I can't do it. I'm asking you man to man." I thought about Ruth then, which I tried not to do as a general rule. I thought about how she would have already been off that wagon and had those women inside by the time I'd finished formulating an opinion. I thought about how she'd have known all their names before the fire was lit. I said, "Pull up to the barn. We'll figure out the sleeping." There were 7 of them. I'm going to tell you about all of them because this story doesn't work if you don't understand all of them, but I'll be quick about the ones who aren't the heart of it. Bertie Scholes was 61 years old and had been a cook at a hotel in Cincinnati until the hotel burned, and she decided that since everything was burned anyway, she might as well be burned somewhere with better sky. She walked with a cane but moved faster than most people half her age. She took over my kitchen inside of an hour and didn't ask permission to do it. Nola and her sister Dace were from a Czech family that had been farming Kansas sod for 12 years until their father died and the bank took the claim. They were in their late 20s, both of them strong as fence posts, and they barely spoke English, but they understood work the way some people understand music, naturally, without having to think about it. Winona Chalk was a schoolteacher from Wichita who had decided she'd rather gamble on a husband she'd never met in person than continue teaching 32 children in a room with no stove. She was precise and a little formal, and she wrote everything down in a small leather notebook she kept in her apron pocket. Elspeth was 17 and had answered the advertisement without her mother's knowledge, which she admitted the second night when she cried quietly by the stove and thought no one could hear her. She was a child who'd made an adult decision and was trying to be brave about where it had put her. And Maren Solly, widow, out of Coshocton, Ohio, 43 years old. She had a face that had been pretty once and had traded that for something better, the kind of face that had seen things and was honest about it. Her hands were work rough. She'd had a farm of her own, she said, until her husband died and the two brothers-in-law descended on the property like a pair of patient crows, and the law gave them what they came for because the law mostly did what brothers-in-law wanted. She didn't tell me all that the first night. She told me slowly, in pieces, the way a careful person tells things, a detail here, a context there, testing to see if the ground held before she put her full weight on it. The first night she didn't say anything to me at all. None of them did much. Gus helped me get the extra straw ticking out of the barn loft where Ruth had stored it, a thing I'd never touched in 3 years, and we arranged the women in the 2 downstairs rooms. I took my blankets out to the barn and slept on a pile of loose hay and stared at the roof boards until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I want to be straight about something. When I say the ranch was falling apart, I mean I had let it fall apart. There's a difference and it matters. Ruth and I had built the place together. Her and me and 2 hands we couldn't really afford in the first 3 years. She had ideas about it that I didn't always understand but trusted. The kitchen garden on the south side of the house to catch the afternoon sun. The way she'd positioned the barn so you could see it from the kitchen window. The roses she'd put along the porch rail that I always thought were a waste of water until they bloomed and I couldn't argue anymore. She died of a fever in February of 1891. It came on fast and it took her in 11 days, and by the time I understood it was going to take her it already had. The doctor from town came out twice. The second time he came out, he told me to be ready, and I told him I was. And that was the biggest lie I'd ever told because there's no such thing as being ready for that. The roses came up that spring without her and I tore them out. Didn't plan to. Went outside one morning and did it, and stood there with the canes in my hands bleeding from the thorns before I knew what I was doing. I planted the space over with prairie grass and the prairie grass took. After that I just stopped fighting the attrition. A fence went down, I'd fix the worst of it and let the rest go. A window cracked, I stuffed a rag in it. The kitchen garden Ruth had planted went to weeds the first summer and I didn't replant it. I fed myself and the horses, and the 20-some cattle I had left, and that was the perimeter of what I could manage. I wasn't trying to die, I want to be clear on that. I was just smaller than I'd been, a man who takes up less room than he used to. Gus stayed 2.5 days. By the time he left, something had shifted in the house that I couldn't have named precisely, but could feel the way you can feel a change in the barometric pressure before a storm comes. Bertie had the kitchen organized in a way that made more sense than the way I'd had it. Nola and Dace had found Ruth's kitchen garden plot, recognized it for what it was despite the weeds, and had pulled the weeds and turned the soil with a mattock they found in the barn, and asked me in gestures, and check whether they could plant garlic because it was almost the right season for garlic. I said yes. I didn't know they were asking about a garden. I thought they were asking about the fence line, which had an old garlic string on the post that I'd put up years ago to keep some fool notion of Ruth's about deer. They planted the garlic, and I figured out what I'd agreed to about 3 days later when I saw the little green starts coming up in rows. Winona had found a leak in the roof above the east bedroom, the same one I'd known about for a year, and had climbed up there herself with a bucket of pitch she found in the barn and fixed it. When I said she didn't need to do that, she said she knew she didn't need to, and went back to what she was writing in her notebook. Elspeth, who was 17 and terrified, turned out to be extraordinary with horses. She didn't say much of anything the first week, but she was in the corral every morning and every evening, and within 10 days the mare who hadn't let anyone but me touch her would follow Elspeth around the paddock like a dog. And Marin fixed the well rope. I came out one morning and she was at the well with a new length of hemp rope from the barn. I hadn't even known I had that much left, and she was splicing it to the old rope with the kind of splice a man does when he's learned to do it right. I said, "Where'd you learn to do that?" She said, "My father ran a ferry before he had the farm. Ropes were a thing in my childhood." I didn't say anything to that. I watched her finish the splice and lower the bucket down and haul it back up without the jerking and slipping that had been happening with the old rope, and I thought about all the mornings I'd stood at that well knowing the rope was going and not fixing it. She handed me the bucket. She didn't make anything of it. She just handed it to me and went back inside. The south fence was the biggest problem. 3 sections down, which meant cattle could get through to the alderman property to the south. And alderman was a man I did not want trouble with, not because I was afraid of him exactly, but because trouble with him had a way of becoming legal trouble, and I didn't have the money for legal trouble. I had the posts and the wire. I'd had them for 6 months. What I hadn't had was I don't know what to call it, the forward motion. On a Monday in the 3rd week after the women arrived, I went out to start on that fence. I had the post hole digger and the wagon and a day's worth of the kind of grim intention that doesn't feel like intention so much as gravity. I got to the first down section, and Nola and Dace were already there. I don't know how they knew I was going to be working that fence. I hadn't said anything about it. But there they were, Nola with the other post hole digger from the barn and Dace with wire cutters and leather work gloves that had belonged to Ruth, which I saw and felt something about but kept to myself. We worked that fence all Monday and all Tuesday, and by Wednesday evening the south fence had 3 new sections in it, set plumb and tight, and I came home to supper that Bertie had made from some combination of canned goods and dried beans that tasted better than anything I'd cooked myself in 3 years. I sat at my own table in my own kitchen with 7 women around me, and I ate without saying much, and they didn't seem to need me to say much. And it was the strangest feeling, not good yet, but not the particular hollow it had been. There were conversations during those weeks that I'll try to recount, though I don't have them perfectly. My memory works better with images than words, always has. One night, this was late October, cold coming in serious now, I was out checking the barn before bed, and Marin came out to ask if the water barrel in the barn was frozen yet. I said no, not yet, but it would be soon. She said she'd noticed there was a second barrel in the tack room that wasn't in use, and asked if it was all right to move it to the kitchen to give them more water in the house during the cold. I said that was fine. Then she didn't go back in. She stood there in the barn door with her arms crossed against the cold, looking out at the dark yard, not looking at anything in particular. I was doing something with the harness that needed doing and didn't need my full attention, so I let it go on for a while before I said, "Something on your mind?" She said, "The others are talking about what to do come spring." I said, "What kind of talking?" She said, "Whether there's a way to make this something permanent, the way things have settled here. Whether there are other men in the county who would take a wife by correspondence, who are more situated than the wreck man was." I said, "I expect there are." She said, "Winona thinks she could take a teaching position in town if there's a school without a teacher." I said, "There's a school without a teacher, has been for 2 years." She said, "And Nola and Dace," she stopped. She said, "They're very good with land." I said, "I've noticed." Then there was a quiet, and the quiet had a shape to it. She said, "I haven't decided what I'll do yet." I said, "You have time to decide." She said, "Do I?" I didn't know what to say to that. It felt like a bigger question than the winter timing of it, and I didn't have the equipment yet to answer a bigger question. So I said, "The barrel's not too heavy to move. I'll bring it over in the morning." She said, "All right," and went back inside. I stood in the barn door for a while after that in the cold looking at the house. There was lamplight in the kitchen window, Bertie up late, or Marin, I couldn't tell from out there. Yellow square against the dark. The sound of the cattle settling in the barn behind me, the low breath of them, the shift of their weight in the straw. I'd had that house for 15 years. Built it with my own hands and Ruth's plans, and more debt than I want to think about even now. I knew every sound it made, and every place the floor creaked, and where the cold came through the walls when the north wind found its angle. I'd stopped really seeing it 3 years ago. Started looking through it the way you look through a window you've stopped noticing is dirty. Standing out there in the cold looking at the lit window, I saw it again. I went back inside and didn't say anything about it to anyone, because there wasn't anything to say yet. But I noticed it, and I filed it somewhere I could find it. November. The cold came in the second week, and with it, a particular quality of light that I'd always thought was the territory's way of telling you that what was coming couldn't be reasoned with. Blue and flat and absolute. You could look out at noon, and the shadows were already the length of evening shadows. I'd been watching the 7 of them settle into the place, and the place settle around them the way water finds the low spots quietly, without announcement. Things got done that I'd been letting go undone. Not because I told anyone to do them, but because a house with people in it generates a kind of forward motion that a house with one man in it does not. The east window got caulked. The hinges on the barn door got oiled. The south corral got a new top rail that I'd had the timber for since spring. I noticed things. I noticed that Bertie saved the bones from whatever meat we had and made a stock from them so nothing was wasted, the way people who have been poor learn to do. I noticed that Winona kept a running list in her notebook of things the property needed and crossed them off when they got done. Not her list, just a list. And that if she saw 2 people about to do the same job, she would quietly redirect one of them without making anyone feel managed. I noticed that Nola talked to the vegetable garden the way Elspeth talked to the horses, in check, low and steady, like she was in a conversation with something that was listening. I noticed that Marin did not miss things. There is a kind of attentiveness that some people have that isn't nosiness and isn't calculation. It's just an orientation toward the world, a way of seeing what's in front of them fully rather than skimming it. Marin had that. She would look at a thing, a fence, a room, a person, and see it straight through, and then she would remember what she saw. She remembered things I'd said in passing that I'd already forgotten. She'd bring them back in context 3 weeks later and they'd be exactly right. It made me careful about what I said, which was not a bad thing for me. I'd gotten sloppy in my thinking from too many years of only having to answer to myself. Elspeth went to stay with a family in town who needed a girl to help with 4 young children, an arrangement Winona made through a letter to a woman she knew there. Elspeth cried when she left, but different tears than the ones she'd cried the second night. Relieved tears, I think. She was going somewhere that fit her better. I gave her a good horse to ride in, one of the mares she'd been working with, and told her she could settle up the price of it when she was on her feet better. She said she would. I believed her. Winona went into town on a Thursday and came back on a Friday evening with a contract in her notebook for the teaching position, starting January. The school board had been so relieved to find anyone at all that they'd offered her a room above the bank as part of the arrangement. She showed me the contract at supper that night, precise and satisfied, the way she looked when something had gone exactly as the logic of it should have predicted. She said, "I hope I haven't been a burden here." I said, "You fixed the roof." She thought about that and nodded and said that was fair. The Czech sisters, Nola and Dace, I want to tell you about them separately because what they did matters. Around the middle of November, Nola came to me with a piece of paper she'd gotten Winona to help her write on, and the paper said, "We know about the alderman land to the south. We know it is good land. We know they want to sell because the son does not want to farm. We have money saved, not much, but some, and we would like to know if there is a way to buy that south section and farm it ourselves if someone would speak for us to the bank." I read it twice. I said to Nola, "How much money?" She held up 4 fingers, then made a gesture I eventually understood to mean $400. I thought about the south section of the Alderman land. I'd watched that land for 15 years thinking about what it could be with the right hands on it. The Aldermans had never worked it right. It needed drainage ditches along the low parts, and they'd never dug them. So the wet years drowned it, and they blamed the land when it was the water management that was wrong. I said, "I'll speak to the bank." I did. And it took 3 weeks and 2 trips to town, and a conversation with aldermen that was awkward in all the usual ways between men who have been cold with each other for years. But in December, Nola and Dace Horacek signed papers on 40 acres of the Alderman South section, and I shook their hands in front of the bank. And Dace said something in Czech that I asked Nola to translate later, and Nola said she'd said, "He's a good man. It was worth coming." I didn't know what to do with that, so I put it away somewhere and went home. That left Maren and Bertie. Bertie was settled in my kitchen and showed no signs of leaving it. I'd said once carefully that she was welcome to stay the winter and we could talk about spring, and she'd said, "I'm 61 years old and I was a hotel cook for 22 years, and I'm telling you right now I'm not sleeping in any more hotel rooms," and that was that. She slept in the east bedroom and she cooked, and she occasionally said things to me in a dry, direct way that reminded me of nobody I'd ever known, and I was grateful for her in the way you're grateful for a good fire. You don't think about it much. You just notice when you come inside and it's there. She had, I learned in pieces, a son somewhere back east who she'd stopped speaking to over a matter she refused to detail, and a sister in Columbus she wrote to on the first Sunday of every month, and an opinion about the proper ratio of fat to flour in a biscuit that she held with the conviction of a woman defending a constitutional principle. I didn't argue with her. I ate the biscuits. What Bertie gave me, and I don't think she knew she was giving it, was a version of ordinary. The hotel of my own house, such as it was. Supper on the table at a time you could count on. Coffee the way you liked it without having to ask. Someone in the next room doing something domestic, so that the dark outside the window was just dark, and not also the size of everything you didn't have. That sounds small. It wasn't small. Maren. By December, Maren and I had fallen into a habit that neither of us had agreed to out loud. After supper, when Bertie had gone to bed, she went early, up at 4. The hotel habits hadn't left her. Maren and I would sit at the kitchen table with the lamp between us and not always talk. Sometimes she'd be sewing something or writing a letter. Sometimes I'd be working on something, mending leather, going over what small accounts I kept. Sometimes we'd talk about the day, the work, what needed doing. It wasn't much, but it was the most I'd talked to another person in 3 years, and I felt it in the way you feel muscles you'd forgotten you had. There were evenings she told me about Ohio, about the particular flatness of that country, and how the sky there was a different kind of big than the sky here, more of a lid than a ceiling, she said, which I thought was about right for Ohio from what little I knew of it. She'd grown up on a farm and gone to school in a one-room building where one teacher ran 4 grades, which was the same education I'd gotten, and we agreed it had served us about as well as any other kind would have. She could read anything and figure numbers faster than I could, and she'd read every book in the house within the first 6 weeks, including 2 that I'd never gotten around to reading myself. And she had opinions about them that she offered with a precision that was, I thought, a little like Winona, and a little like nobody I'd met before. I caught myself looking forward to those evenings. I didn't examine that too closely. She told me about her husband over the course of several of those evenings, in the piece-by-piece way she told things. His name had been Lars. He'd been a good man by her account, steady, funny in a quiet way, the kind of man who fixed things before they broke rather than after. She said, he was better with the farm than I was, to be honest. I held it together after he died, but I didn't improve it. I just held it. I said, "That's something." She said, "I suppose." Then his brothers came. She didn't say much more about the brothers, and I didn't push. One night she asked me about Ruth. I told her a little. How we'd met, which was at a land auction in Dodge where she'd come with her father and I'd come with nothing but intention, and we'd ended up arguing about the same parcel of ground. How she'd laughed at something I said when I wasn't trying to be funny, which had done something to me I couldn't entirely explain. How she'd taken to the land out here the way some people take to water. Maren said, what was she like at the end? Nobody had ever asked me that. People asked how she died, what the fever had been, whether the doctor had come quickly enough. Nobody ever asked what she'd been like. I thought about it for a while. I said I had to find the right word. I said she was clear. That's the word I'd use. Right to the end she was clear. She knew what was happening and she wasn't afraid of it the way I was afraid of it, and she held my hand and told me things she wanted me to know, things she'd never said before, I think because she'd always figured there'd be time to say them later. And then there wasn't time and she said them anyway, and they were true things. Maren didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, she sounds like someone I would have liked. I said she would have liked you too, and I meant it. January was hard. The cold came in serious, and the cattle needed tending in a way that was close to constant, and Bertie's hip gave her trouble in the cold, and she didn't say anything about it, but I could see it in how she moved, and how she held the counter edge when she thought nobody was looking. I started bringing more of the wood in so she wouldn't have to carry it. I did it before she was up so she wouldn't have to watch me do it. I lost one steer in the first week of January to something in the gut that I couldn't diagnose and wouldn't have been able to fix if I had. Found him down by the south fence, already stiff. I dragged him out past the property line and let the weather and whatever else have him, the way you do. It's one of those things on a ranch that you get used to and don't get used to at the same time. It's your animal and your loss, but it's also just nature doing what nature does, and you can't make it personal or you'll go broke doing it. I'd learned that from Ruth's father, who'd ranched the same ground for 40 years and had the same philosophy about loss in general that he had about dead cattle. The thing is done. Now figure out what's next. I thought about Ruth's father sometimes during that January. A man named Orrin who had the look of someone who'd been winnowed down to essentials by the weather and the work, not diminished but concentrated, the way a good reduction of stock thickens rather than weakens. I'd wanted to be that kind of man and wasn't sure I'd gotten there. I thought maybe grief had done the wrong kind of winnowing to me, taken things out that should have stayed in. There was a week in the middle of January when the temperature dropped to something that turned the air itself into an enemy, and I was out breaking ice on the stock tank every morning before daylight, and coming in so cold I couldn't feel my hands for an hour afterward, the skin going tight and white before the burning started. I had good gloves, but cold like that goes through wool like wool isn't there. 3 mornings in a row I came back in, and had to hold my hands over the stove before I could make a fist properly. The 4th morning Maren was already up. She wasn't usually up that early. But she was at the stove and the coffee was poured, and when I came in through the door still locked up from the cold, she set down what she was doing and came across the kitchen and took my hands. Just took them both in hers without asking. Held them between her palms and stood there while the burning worked its way in from outside and the feeling came back, which is the part that's worse than the numbness. The sensation of your hands thawing is not a comfortable thing, and she didn't say anything about it. She didn't say your hands are cold or you should get better gloves or any of the other things a person might reasonably say. She just held them until I stopped shaking. Then she let go and handed me the coffee, and went back about what she was doing. I stood there with the cup and thought, well, just that well. There was a man who came around in February. His name was Cutter Vane, and he was well dressed for the territory, which usually means something, and it meant something here. He was looking, he said, for a wife. He'd heard there were women at the Hearn place. He came to the front door on a Wednesday afternoon, and I answered it, and he made his case. He had a place up north, good-sized, solid house, could offer a woman a comfortable life. He'd be interested in meeting whoever was available. Bertie, from somewhere in the kitchen, said loudly that she was 61 and not interested. He laughed politely and said he'd heard there was a younger widow. Maren had come to the kitchen doorway. She looked at the man the way she looked at most things, steadily, taking measure, not particularly hurried about it. He took off his hat and introduced himself to her and was pleasant enough, and she was polite enough, and he said he'd call again next week if she was willing to think it over. After he left, I went back to what I'd been doing in the barn, which was nothing worth going back to, just getting out of the kitchen because the kitchen felt small and I needed larger air. Bertie came out to the barn about an hour later, which she didn't normally do. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed in the cold and looked at me in a measuring way. I said, "Something you need, Bertie." She said, "I came to tell you something, and I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going back inside because it's cold and my hip hurts." I said, "All right." She said, "I've been around men and women both for 61 years, and I know the difference between a man who's watching and a man who's not watching. And I know the difference between a woman who's waiting and a woman who isn't. And I'm telling you that girl in there is waiting. And if you're too dim to see it, then you're not the man I think you are. And if you see it and are just scared, then you'd better get over being scared, because a woman doesn't wait forever." I said, "Bertie." She said, "I'm going back inside." I said, "Did she ask you to say that?" Bertie said, "That woman would never ask anyone to speak for her in her life, and if you don't know that by now, you haven't been paying attention." And she went back inside. I stood there with a piece of harness in my hand that I'd been cleaning for the better part of an hour and had not made much progress on, and I thought about what Bertie had said, and I thought about Maren, and I thought about the particular quality of looking that Maren had, and whether I'd been reading it right. I'd been reading it right. I'd been reading it right for weeks and choosing not to trust what I was reading, because choosing not to trust something is safer than trusting it and being wrong. But safe and right aren't always the same country. She came out to the barn that evening. I heard her come in, and I didn't turn around. She said he was well presented. I said he was. She said his hands were too clean. I didn't say anything. She said, "A man whose hands are clean like that in February in this country either doesn't do any work or doesn't do his own work. I'm not interested in either one." I said he might be a good man. She said he might be, but I know what I'm looking for, and it isn't clean hands and a comfortable life. She stopped. She said, "I know what I'm looking for, Caleb." I turned around then. The light in the barn was the late afternoon kind, coming through the boards in flat cold stripes, and she was standing there with her arms not crossed this time, just at her sides, and she was looking at me the way she'd looked at the ranch that first night, steadily, taking the full measure of it, and not disgusted by what she saw. I said, "I'm a long way from what I was." She said, "I know that. I've been watching you come back." I said, "I don't know if I'm coming back or just getting used to less." She said, "I've been watching you for 4 months. You fixed that fence you'd been circling for a year. You went a bat for those girls at the bank when you didn't have to. You brought the firewood in all winter so Bertie's hip wouldn't trouble her, and you did it quiet enough that she thinks she hasn't noticed, but she has. She told me. She said you were the kind of man who takes care of things without needing to be seen taking care of them. She said, that is not a man who's getting used to less." I didn't have an answer for that. I looked at the barn floor. There was an old coffee can there with bent nails in it that I'd been meaning to straighten for 6 months and hadn't gotten to, and I looked at it and thought about how long it had been sitting there. She said, "I'm not interested in going somewhere else. I want to stay here," and I think she stopped. She said, "I think I'd like to stay here with you, if you want that." She said it plain. Not the way you say something you've rehearsed, but the way you say something you've been carrying and finally decided the carrying was harder than the saying. I said, "I want that." She came to me then, not rushing. She crossed the barn and she put her hand flat against my chest, against my coat, and she looked up at me with those dark measuring eyes, and what was in them wasn't pity and it wasn't charity. It was a woman who'd seen a man whole and decided he was worth it. I put my hand over hers. That's the thumbnail if you're looking for one. The barn light coming through in stripes, her hand on my chest and mine over it. I should tell you how things settled. Winona taught school in town and did it well by all accounts. She wrote in her notebook, and she wrote to us occasionally, formal letters that were warm underneath the formality, which was her way. Elspeth grew up eventually. I heard she married a man in the territory who raised horses, which seemed right. Nola and Dace worked that south section the way I always thought it should be worked. First year they dug the drainage ditches. Second year they put in winter wheat, and it came up straight and heavy. By the third year the alderman who'd sold it to them was stopping by to look over the fence with something between envy and respect. Bertie stayed, she's still here. She's 67 now and her hip gives her trouble and she has strong opinions about how supper should be timed, and she feeds the horses scraps they don't need, and she talks to them in a way I'm certain she doesn't talk to people, and I have stopped trying to understand Bertie and simply accept her as a feature of the property, like the well or the barn. And Maren. We married in April in town, with Bertie and Nola and Dace there, which was enough. The preacher made it quick, which I appreciated. Maren wore a dark dress with small blue flowers that she'd made herself from fabric Winona had left behind, and she looked, well, she looked the way she always looked, clear and steady and not trying to be anything other than what she was, which I had come to understand was no small thing. We walked back to the wagon after, and the day was one of those April days that the territory gets sometimes when the sky goes a particular color, almost green at the horizon, and the light is clean and sharp, and she took my arm and didn't let go of it the whole ride home. The roses. I planted roses along the porch rail in May. Different ones than Ruth's. I didn't know what kind Ruth had had. I'd torn them out too fast to notice. I bought 3 canes from a woman in town who grew them. I don't know what variety. Maren asked me about them when she saw me digging. I said something I'd been thinking about for a while. I said, there are things that got tended here before and there should be things that get tended here now. Something that blooms. She looked at me for a moment, and then she got down in the dirt next to me and helped me put the first one in. They bloomed in June, red, not the pale kind, the deep red. I don't know what else to tell you. The ranch is what it should be now. The well rope doesn't fray anymore. The south fence is solid. There's garlic in the kitchen garden next to the other things Maren has put in. In the evening, sometimes, I stand on the porch before I go in and I look at what there is to look at, the barn, the south fence, the land running out to where the Horisic girls are working their piece of it, and I feel the weight of it differently than I used to. Not lighter, heavier maybe, but the right kind of heavy, the kind a man can carry without bowing. There's a lamp on in the kitchen window. Maren and Bertie will be in there, or just Maren if Bertie's already gone up. The lamp puts a yellow square of light out onto the porch boards. I go inside.